J'ai le plaisir de...
It is my pleasure to open this third substantive session of today, which is devoted to the issue of online incitement, terrorist narratives, and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. During this session, the three panelists will identify and analyze key aspects of terrorist exploitation of information and communications technologies, including the internet, to disseminate terrorist narratives. I would like warmly to welcome the three experts who are taking part in this debate. Each of them will make a maximum 12-minute presentation. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Bharath Ganesh from the Oxford Internet Institute and Voxpol. Mr. Ganesh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of trying to regulate and manage all of the content that tends to be put online, and a lot of it which reaches into this area around extremism. Now, I want to focus on three different actors. So that's going to be looking at nation states, the private sector, particularly social media companies, and civil society. But what I want to do is to try to take this to a slightly different angle. And in doing so, I want to sort of problematize some of the different tensions that we have when trying to look into how best to combat online extremism. So to discuss that in a little bit more depth, I have three kind of main problem areas that I want to develop. The first one is around content moderation and censorship. The second is on the role and the politics of the private sector. The third is on counter-narratives and the engagement of civil society. I think in each of these three areas, there's a significant number of challenges that need to be surmounted before approaches to countering extremist narratives are going to be effective, and before we're going to be able to actually learn how to measure and analyze the efficacy of different kinds of counter-extremist initiatives. So one of the things that I want to do is actually think a little bit about what kind of outcomes are emerging from these three sets of actors that are coming together. One of the really key questions I think hasn't been asked in this agenda is understanding the role of power and who's actually accumulating power in the way that this agenda is playing out. So what I mean by that is I think that social media companies and technology companies have a disproportionate amount of power in this agenda. Nation states, of course, bear the brunt of the responsibility for dealing with extremism, but there is a tension between nation states and the private sector that I think needs to be worked out. And I hope to bring out some of those problems in order to better think about the ways we might approach that. Moving on, then, I'd like to sort of think about what kind of implications this power distribution has for how we do content moderation and censorship, how the private sector reaches out to civil society, and how states are able to engage civil society, and then understand sort of how counter-narratives might work in this area. So I've kind of put together four general questions that I'd like to raise that are sort of areas that are lacking in terms of understanding content moderation and censorship. And when I'm talking about content moderation, what I'm talking about is a private sector company like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Those are the big ones, but there's hundreds of others that are involved in this agenda, deciding to take down some kind of content or deciding to enact some kind of punitive measure on a user, such as suspending their account for a few days or taking their account away, taking down content that they've written for any number of reasons. And the kind of primary reasons that this is happening, especially in the role around extremism, is looking at hate speech as well as incitement to violence. Those are sort of the two big categories. Now, one of the key problems here is we don't actually know how effective disruption is. Now, we've heard from a few different speakers that, for example, when Twitter and other social media companies began actively trying to disrupt Daesh's efforts in terms of in terms of recruitment and disseminating propaganda online, there was a very rapid reduction in their ability to use mainstream platforms like Twitter to go about disseminating information. On the other hand, this has also led groups like Daesh into kind of different areas of the internet that are much harder to monitor, much harder to police, and also, for example, are encrypted. So their migration to Telegram, for example, is one kind of way you might think about the sort of the kind of cost benefit of getting involved in doing takedowns and other types of disruption techniques. So one thing we really need to understand, and I think this is a key area for collaboration between the private sector and the scientific community, is understanding how effective disruption and takedown techniques are. The second point I'd like to raise is around the kind of controversial politics of censorship. So one thing that we've seen is that when IS accounts tend to be taken down, this leads to... So when IS accounts get taken down, this leads to a certain increase in their likelihood to come back. So what happens is when someone gets censored on Twitter for some kind of for hate speech or for incitement to violence or engaging in some kind of terrorist communication, they get their account taken down, they tend to come back, and that actually leads to a sort of an increased level of sense of participation and integration into these networks. So I do a lot of work looking into right-wing extremism in the United Kingdom and the United States. And one of the things that we've seen there is actually an entire mobilization of right-wing extremist activity around the concept of the freedom of speech being taken away from people. So just a few weeks ago in London, there was a march attended by a few thousand people that was called Day for Freedom, and that was entirely sort of centered around this issue of free speech and the sense that in the kind of parlance of the extreme right, the liberal establishment was trying to silence extreme right, legitimate conservative voices. So there's this really kind of controversial politics of censorship that emerges when we're trying to deal with this issue. And in a lot of ways, it actually can lead to a lot of counterproductive social situations that emerge afterwards. Which one is IS accounts coming back online after getting a sense of being a martyr. In another sense, you have sort of movements being built around this issue, around the freedom of speech. So this kind of gets me into the main thing that I want to problematize when we're talking about content moderation and censorship. It's the sort of subjective ways in which extremism is being defined. Now, in the United Kingdom, there's one particular definition of extremism, and this one actually covers violent extremism and nonviolent extremism. This obviously is not the same across all nation states. So there's kind of socially and specifically situated ways in which extremism is understood in each and every society and member state. So trying to grapple with this problem is one of the big challenges I think that we need to sort of set out and try to address. One of the big kind of ways that we might make a contribution towards doing that is trying to understand a continuum from hate speech to extremism. One of the previous speakers on the second panel today spoke a little bit about how hateful ideas are being normalized through internet propaganda. These hateful ideas often do not fall into the definition of what we'd call violent extremism, but there's a continuum in terms of these hateful ideas and then the expression of extremism. And by the time people are expressing violent extremism, they've already been kind of radicalized by a certain set of hateful ideas. So this is one of those tensions that we really need to start to work out. There's legal and protected speech that's still hate speech, that's defined differently in every country, and it has a lead-in into the way that we might think about extremism or what kind of effects that extremism might have. So these are sort of kind of the issues that we have to start grappling with. What we've seen happen recently, however, is that the private sector has kind of emerged more and more as a global actor. And one of the things that I tried to set out at the start is the idea that I think the private sector has a sort of disproportionate amount of power in this area. So the private sector has a huge amount of resource, and they also have a huge amount of responsibility because they're the ones who run content moderation, and also are quite involved in terms of funding counter-narrative work. So there's, I think, three areas that really need to be evaluated when we think about what kind of work the private sector is doing in this kind of emerging set of governmental responses and multi-stakeholder responses to online extremism. So the first is, I think we really need to start thinking about how do we understand the effectiveness of the emerging responses from the private sector, as well as public-private partnerships. There's a lot of times in which, for example, the UK government has contracted out to private sector companies. We've seen this happen in other nation states as well. But one of the key problems here is we don't actually have a good basis for figuring out how to evaluate the efficacy of this kind of work. So in that area, I'd kind of make one recommendation that I think is quite important, is having some kind of independent international body involved in some kind of oversight of these companies, and as well as this agenda. And that kind of leads into the next point. One of the key things is that though the private sector has a huge amount of money and they work quite well with a large range of think tanks, there's not a lot of oversight into understanding which voices the kind of participatory, which voices are actually able to participate in this agenda. So one way of kind of thinking about that is in the United Kingdom, a lot of studies of the PREVENT strategy, which is a preventing violent extremist set of policy measures, has found that there's been a very selective engagement with particular groups of the Muslim community in Britain. One of the key issues is whether or not those kinds of exclusions are being replicated when it comes to the private sector getting involved. So one of the key things I think is independent review can really help to ensure that there's a diversity of voices involved in shaping how the private sector engages with CVE. And secondly, I think the scientific community needs to play a much more prominent role in this agenda. This is something that's not happened as much, and there's again been somewhat of a selective way in which the scientific community has been brought into this area. So finally, there's another set of kind of issues about how do we measure and understand counter-narratives. There's, I think, a lot. I was kind of coming here, I was reviewing the data that's been published recently around this area, and there's a lot of different conflicting debates. There's a lot of different conflicting methodologies for counter-narratives. So one thing is kind of measuring the effectiveness of counter-narratives. And one of the sort of general problems that I've noticed in this area is that there's kind of some people who do very large studies of counter-narratives, who use kind of big data methods and computational methods to understand this. There's another side where it's much kind of focused on specific impacts on specific people and small groups. So there's sort of two very different data sets that we have to contend with and grapple with in order to try to understand how effective counter-narrative campaigns really are, and sort of trying to find a way around some of these problems, such as kind of use of big data versus very small, not necessarily representative studies to understand the effectiveness of counter-narratives, should make us kind of, I think, be a little bit more cautious in the amount of confidence that we place in counter-narrative campaigns. So the other thing is, the evidence and the discussion, especially in the previous two panels, has stressed the importance of the role of civil society in all of this. And again, I would stress that actually the inclusion of civil society in the design of counter-narratives is really important. One, because of course, civil society are often the people who are tasked with actually delivering counter-narrative services. On top of that, another thing is that civil society groups are quite well informed about kind of the different issues that people in their community face. So for example, work on anti-Muslim hate crime in the United Kingdom has a very good set of data and a good sense of how to address counter-jihad extremism and right-wing extremism. But these groups aren't always being consulted. And what happens is that some of the kind of technological solutions that are being used to counter extremism or to detect hate speech or to detect extremism, which center around supervised machine learning, which requires kind of putting in a data set of stuff that we've already recognized this is extremist, and then a machine goes and learns that and then kind of is able to kind of infer in the future what kind of material is similar. Now, there's a lot of bias that can go into this kind of process depending on what kind of words, what kind of statements, and what kind of definitions you have about extremism. And that can really bias the outcomes that technology is going to have in terms of trying to detect and understand extremism. So one of the things that we need to do, I think, is we need to start thinking kind of a little more cautiously around the area of counter-narratives to put it into context with these other different forms of governance, such as content moderation and some of the actions taken by the private sector, and understand that there's sort of a difference between positive approaches and negative approaches. And that's not positive in terms of what's good or negative in terms of what's bad. Positive means kinds of approaches that add something new. So counter-narratives fit in with that, right? So counter-narratives try to produce an alternative kind of way of thinking about the world, whereas negative approaches, which are much more kind of close to content moderation, are about taking things out. So we really need to sort of think about the tensions between these two approaches. And then sort of finally, my last comment on counter-narratives is that there's a lot of discussion around formal approaches to developing counter-narratives. So formal are different actions or different interventions taken by states, by civil society, and by the private sector to do counter-narrative work. But there's also a lot of activists on these social media platforms that are already trying to engage in counter-narrative work. So there's a whole range of counter-narrative activity that doesn't fit into what we might recognize as such. So I'm talking about kind of activists who might be out trolling counter-jihadists on the internet or trolling the far right on the internet, just as we see groups within Muslim communities across the world challenging the types of narratives that you see coming out from groups like Daesh. So what I'm trying to say there is that there's already a set of organic movements that we need to consider when we're looking at how counter-narratives work. So I kind of want to just bring it back to some sort of key tensions. So the first one is sort of around content, right? We have hate speech, extremism, extremist speech. We have nonviolent extremism. We have violent online extremism. We have incitements to violence. And I would like to get us to think about this as a broad continuum. But we shouldn't only just focus on content. I think one of the key things we need to do is also think about how do we disrupt networks in the way that they operate, right? So it's not just about someone's posting hateful or extreme content, but it's also about having the knowledge and the analysis that tells us what are the groups of users that are trying to do this, and then going out and trying to model and understand the ways that we might be able to attack the networks that they're building in order to disseminate propaganda. Another point that I'd like to bring out is sort of the power of the private sector, I think, is quite disproportionate in this area. And until now, especially with kind of what we've seen in Germany, as well as sort of the kind of scandal around Cambridge Analytica, we've started to see national sovereignty being used in terms of more leverage on the private sector. But I think it's quite important that nation states continue to move forward, trying to ensure that they're representing the interests of their citizens and civil society groups within their country to put pressure on the private sector to take the kind of action that they think is important. And finally, one of the key sort of issues in terms of being able to deliver useful technological solutions requires us to reach out to a wide range of people in global civil society. And this is one area where I think nation states need to step in, and I think a lot of nation states could be doing a better job. And one way to go about doing that is really sort of trying to think through the different competing interests within community groups and faith communities within nation states, and finding a way to integrate a really wide range of voices. So with that, I'd like to end my remarks, and thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Ganesh for his presentation on the problems and challenges when it comes to online content, and in particular the responsibility of the private sector in this domain, and the need to look at the inclusivity of different parts of society. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Jasmine Jauhar, Assistant Director of the Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counterterrorism in Malaysia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to thank CTED and CTC for inviting us here. It is a real pleasure to be part of this very important meeting. So my task today is to, what I'll be speaking on today is basically looking at the Southeast Asia perspective of how terrorists are basically using the internet. What are some of the activities that takes place online, and some of the challenges where we try to develop effective counter-narratives. So these are some of my the content of my presentation. First, I would like to look at the overview of terrorist use of the internet. So basically, based on research, based on studies, some of the major activities that takes place online includes propaganda, radicalization, and recruitment of terrorists. Obviously, to communicate and network, to fund, as well as to plan and train, as well as to coordinate attacks. I don't want to dwell on this too much on why the internet is such an interesting platform for terrorists to use or to abuse, essentially because it's self-explanatory. But what I would like to pinpoint here is one of the most interesting factor about the internet is it allows people to cherry pick information. Now, what do I mean by cherry picking information? This is where users, especially in this case, terrorists, or those who are looking for information regarding terrorism, so on. The internet allows for the user to cherry pick information, to select information which reinforces their worldview. So basically, they search for information that only they want to see or believe, they want to read. So this sort of limits critical thinking in this sense. It happens a lot with youth. When they want to search for something, they search specifically for something that they believe is the case, and not look for other things. So this is something that is very, very interesting and concerning when it comes to looking for information on the internet. It allows for you to specifically pick what you want to believe or what you want to read. So when we look at internet and the spread of terrorist narratives, what we want to look at is who is basically spreading these narratives. And one of the most important thing that we need to understand is that the narratives are not being spread by the terrorists themselves or Daesh Core themselves, for example. It is being spread by members and sympathizers and supporters that have no direct affiliation, no direct contact with Daesh themselves. So this complicates the issue because once they've released, for example, a information or a video, this would then get picked up by the sympathizers and the members and redistribute over and over and over again on their platforms, reaching out to their friends, so it multiplies. So it becomes very, very difficult when we try to, for example, limit the access of society to this kind of images, videos, articles, posts, and so on. So it becomes very difficult because it multiplies so fast. And even though we take down websites or content, negative content in this case, would still have it would have reached a small amount of people, and still it can multiply in that sense. So how are terrorists spreading their narratives? So obviously through social media platforms. So for example, in Malaysia, the use of Facebook is more often used to gather information, to communicate with others, to basically learn more about these issues. Also online communication apps. So this is a bit more active when they start to play active role in terrorist-related activities. So, for example, Telegram and WhatsApp are generally used in Southeast Asia as well when it comes to planning attacks or when it comes to communicating with other terrorist members or cells. But we must also remember that narratives are also not spread through only spread through online means. It is also through offline means, and this is very pertinent because in Malaysia, for example, some of the groups are going offline. This is due to fear of being captured by the authorities, and so they become even more secretive in this sense. So they work offline as well, and through religious, for example, through religious meetings and so on. So it also goes, it is also spread offline. So what are they basically saying, especially in the Southeast Asia context? so the West versus Asia. Well, there are overlapping areas, issues such as, for example, plight of the Muslims around the world. Point in case the Palestinian issue and some of the issues that are going on in the Middle East. These are some of the overlapping issues that are being used. But also, when it comes to Asia, the increased focus is towards politics, towards governance, as compared to in the West, because where the West are mainly about victimhood and sense of belonging and so on. So when we look at Asia, it's more of political governance as well as religious aspects to the narratives. So this is just looking at the Asia's perspective. So what are some of the narratives that they're saying? So when it comes to politics and governance, if you look at the second point, politics and government, they talk a lot about secular governments, about anti-democracy, about how the government must implement the Sharia law in order for it to be accepted by them, and it couples with religious-based, for example, atonement. So some of those who have been arrested in Malaysia spoke of atonement. They've done sins in the past, which they feel that they need to cleanse themselves. So this is one of the shortcuts that they find that could help them to sort of cleanse their sins. It's also finding the meaning of life, filling in the void. Now, I was talking to a number of researchers in Singapore, in Malaysia, and some of the things that they've mentioned to me is that when they asked someone who wanted to join a terrorist group, why do they want to join? And more often than not, the answer is they want to fill the void inside of themselves, filling in the gaps, because they feel there's something missing, and this is also another challenge because it's so subjective. So how do we basically tackle this issue? So it becomes complicated when they cite such motivation. But apart from that, there's also other religious-based issues that they've mentioned. There's also the social side of things. Some of the lead women that went to Syria and Iraq from Malaysia wanted to get married to one of the members of Daesh. They want to be part of that group fighting for a good cause, apparently, and some of them are just and this is based on people who have been arrested. Some of them felt lonely, so they wanted something that they could feel they're doing something big. So this is some of the things that have been cited by those who were arrested in Malaysia, and of course, plight of the Muslim, oppressions, violence. So these are some of the things that have been mentioned in terms of motivating them to join terrorist groups. So I would like to look at some of the uses of the internet through the process of radicalization and recruitment via the internet. So in the case of Malaysia, this is just a general overview of how terrorists are basically using the internet to radicalize and recruit. And they first begin with selection of individuals. So like I've mentioned just now, Facebook is greatly used in Malaysia for this sort of purposes. So they would go. So if terrorists were looking to recruit, what they would first do is to select individuals from, for example, a humanitarian page for Syria. So in Malaysia we have, this is just an example, but in Malaysia there's Syria Can, there are a lot of other Facebook pages that fights for this cause in Syria and Iraq, in humanitarian grounds. So what they would do is they'll go on this page and select the individuals who they deem to be vulnerable to their narratives. And once they have selected this individual, they would go through a vetting process where they will look at his comments, his or her comments, like their inclination towards the idea. So this is the first round of vetting. And once they find that this individual could be in a way recruited, they would then add as friend. But at this point of first interaction, they won't be talking about Daesh, they won't be talking about Syria or Iraq. They would first try to build that sort of bond with the user, with the individual, to gain their trust, and they would talk about hobbies, current affairs, family, religion, just to build that bond, that trust. Before they go any further. And another round of vetting would take place at this point, where they would see the inclination of the individual, if this person would be able to, is able to be recruited to their cause. Once they find that this person can sort of be recruited, they would then add they would then add this individual into a private group, a Facebook private group, where the radicalization process would take place here, through the private groups, through sending reading materials, sharing of information, and once again another round of vetting would take place, to see if this person is really, really someone that they need, someone that would be able to execute the projects or tasks that they've been given. And if they find that this individual is able to do it, they would then move the conversation into a more secure platform. So in this case, it would be WhatsApp. In this case, it would be Telegram. So they would be invited into these platforms, where another round of selection would take place. And their inclination, would gauge their inclination towards Daesh ideology. This is also where fundraising would take place. Please help our brothers and sisters over there. We need money. We need to make sure that they're okay. Please send us money. This donation happens through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through Telegram, and also planning of attacks, training in neighboring countries or to Syria and Iraq. So the planning of attack had actually taken place in Malaysia through Telegram. So I'll give you an example of that in a short while. So this is an example of one of women recruiter, Malaysian women recruiter in Syria. So she went to Syria. I think it was in 2014. So she's very active in using Twitter, Blogspot, Tumblr. So she would often tell her stories, daily lives there, the grievances, the happy life she leads there with the husband, and then she would then tell a story about how her husband is going to fight, how she's scared about his safety. So she's a good storyteller, and she managed to basically garner a lot of support from especially women who wanted to go to Syria. So she would encourage them to go to Syria. So this chat is basically talking about her friend who they met through Facebook, and how she had encouraged her to migrate to migrate to Syria, and spoke of her grievances of how her friend died in an airstrike. So this captivated a lot of readers and wanting to read more and more of her writings. So she was able to recruit a number of people. Another example is this group called Gagak Hitam or Black Crow. It was led by a Malaysian who was in Syria. I mean, he was killed in Raqqa in April 2016. Was it 2017? So his name was Muhammad Wandi Muhammad Jadi. So he was very, very active recruiter on Facebook and Telegram. So his method of he would recruit people on Facebook and plan attacks on Telegram. He would break the group into smaller cells on Telegram and smaller channels on Telegram. So one cell would be responsible for obtaining explosives, for example. Another one for funding, and so on. So he was very good at planning this. So one of the attacks, there was only one attack in Malaysia so far. It was the Movida Club nightclub attack the last year. So this attack was led by Muhammad Wandi, who was able to basically plan the entire thing on Telegram. So this is one of the examples of how terrorists are actually planning planning attacks on online. Now I'd like to turn your attention to developing counter-narratives. After looking at all of these examples and how they're basically recruiting, radicalizing, when we try to, in the case of Malaysia, we're also trying to develop counter-narratives targeting our audiences. But when we try to do this, we find that there are challenges, and I would like to talk a bit about the challenges we face when we are developing counter-narratives. In our case, getting the right voices to speak is the messengers, so to speak, is a challenge because. Okay, so I don't have much time, so I'm trying to speed this up. So getting the right voices to speak the messenger. The target audience, unfortunately, may not view the government to be may not view governments favorably. So we need to basically look at other means, and we need to choose these messengers who resonate well with target audience. So, for example, we're looking at religious leaders, we're looking at lecturers, we're looking at teachers who can basically resonate with our target audience, specifically the youth. And also another issue that we find is matching the rate and speed of narratives produced by terrorists and their supporters, because the narratives are not only being distributed by the members themselves, but also the supporters and sympathizers. Like I said, this created a sort of challenge to counter the rate and speed of narratives being produced online. Also, this includes bureaucracy. While the terrorists can just sit down and type at their computer at home, and we are at work trying to get out counter narratives, it has to pass through several layers. So these are some of the things that we find to be a bit of a challenge. Reaching the right target audience, finding the right concerns that would trigger action. I may have the same concern, but it doesn't lead me to conduct attack. So what is this factor that leads them to conduct attack? So these are some of the things that we need to understand. And for this to happen, and for example, in addition, in Malaysia, we have overlapping identities as well. So we need to understand whether our target audience sort of take themselves as, so we have Malay, so I'm Malay, I'm also a Muslim, and I'm Malaysian. So when you talk about overlapping identities, for our target audience, do they identify themselves first as Malaysians, or as Malay, or as Muslims? So we need to make sure that we understand the target audience in this sense as well. So a baseline study or mapping of this social network in a country, in Malaysia, for example, is very, very important when it comes to understanding our target audience. It's also important to inspire passion in countering narrative for terrorists. Terrorists are good at stirring passion in this sense. So for us, like, we come to work, although we are passionate about this countering narratives, but we come to work at 9, we go back at 5, but they are ongoing, they're throughout around the clock. So this is developing kind of some challenges. So conclusion, it is very important that we enhance our public and private partnerships, especially, and I think it is really, really important that we empower our gatekeepers. So what do I mean by gatekeepers? Parents and teachers, and especially peers. So at CRSAT, the agency that I work for, we have done a program that try to enhance the capabilities and skills of the student leaders in conducting their own CVE programs in the university setting, in their own university setting. So we managed to gather about 100 student leaders, and train them. And they've also come up with narratives on their own, make sure that they understand the landscape. And we've also produced a manual for them to guide them in terms of conducting this sort of CVE programs back at their universities. So these are some of the important things that I think we need to empower the gatekeepers as well. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank Ms. Jawa for her presentation on the ways to reduce the internet, as has been seen in Southeast Asia and in particular in Malaysia, and in particular when it comes to recruitment. And I'd like to thank you for underscoring the construction of counter-narratives. I now give the floor to Ms. Audrey Alexander, Research Fellow with the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. You have the floor.
Thanks so much. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here. What an incredible place to be with an awesome group of people. So I just want to thank CTED for pulling this all together. I know that conference planning is rough, so thrilled to be here. So diving right in, today I want to focus on the medium because we've laid out a lot about the message. And a lot of the work that I've done, I'm very thankful and grateful because I get to build it on the back of the incredible work that my peers and colleagues have done, including up here today, and sort of highlighting what is the message and why is it so convincing. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the medium and what that means in terms of transferability. Well, we talk a lot about narratives and trying to say how can we pull on this to address the far right or vice versa. I think when it comes to the tools and the way that they're using tools, this is something where we can actually really start sharing that information. If an organization shares bomb-making instructions, why can't they share tools as well? So being able to sort of learn from that approach is very critical. So first things first, this is from about a year ago, or exactly a year ago. It's from May. It's produced by a pro-IS group called Yakin Media. And I think what this item really shows is that IS and its affiliates really do care about its strategic messaging. We do see an error. Anyone see it? I'm mostly just excited to use the laser pointer at the UN. So right over here, it's an interesting way to write numbers. Well, up here, we have a foreign affairs translation that isn't correct. So interesting that they're winning, or that we are completely failing, but they're doing some of their own hashtag failures in this propaganda product themselves. And then over here, they say more than 1,000 new accounts made by the Islamic State supporters each day on Twitter. If you do basic calculations with any of the transparency reports produced by Twitter itself, you know, they really are not keeping pace with what they should be. They're shutting down more than that many accounts every day. So it's kind of an odd point for them to be advertising. But what this really shows is that they're interested in the message, that they are doing really well. I think this is something that we need to pay attention to. Because right now, we're starting to see a difference in the way that tools have changed what terrorist organizations are capable of and what they can do. Because we have a top-down component, and this is the strategic messaging parts of the organization. But then we have this mass grassroots mobilization. And what that happens on a global stage is so different than what you see in sort of Maoist insurgencies and looking at other insurgencies around the world. But one of the critical pillars that we do need to learn from history is that insurgencies almost always adopt the tools from the societies that they're rebelling against. And that's a trend that we're seeing here today, and that's something that we can use in the future to understand where these trends are going. So I worked on a paper called Digital Decay, which was a 2-year-long study, essentially, of IS online. We understand a lot about how they came to power with social media, but what happens when we start to exert force to them in that arena? That's sort of the critical question of the piece and what I was trying to look at. Some of the things I learned about them is that they're strategically opportunistic and they're skilled problem solvers. They're very willing to adapt. Next, they're adaptable and volatile and continuously influenced by the competing agendas of organizations, states, companies, and of course, the individual users and their own aspirations. I think that although discussions about the online space often distinguish the online and offline arenas as two different spaces, this is a false dichotomy and it really lacks utility. Because just as an extremist will choose to use a certain tool based on their own aspirations, so why might I use a tool with encryption if I'm in attack planning versus if I'm trying to disseminate propaganda to a large audience? The online space is also intimately connected to things like battles, attacks, and current events. So seeing the relationship between these two and understanding how we can start to leverage that is critical. I think that all in all, these factors really show that online extremists are defiant of straightforward analysis, and, this is going to be the best observation ever. Not very easy to apply with or to address with convenient solutions. So that's very useful, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, I think a critical thing that I notice is that violent extremists in the digital sphere do not ruminate over losses. They move on quick and fight to be heard. And I think that this is something that we really need to pay attention to and adapt more ourselves instead of sort of talking about what we've done wrong and what we've done wrong and what we've done wrong, and start focusing on where we can go. So moving forward, just like jihadists, I decided to use a meme to sort of make my views mainstream. So anywhere online, you see that this is what I think I look like and this is what I actually look like. So I did the same, except for what we think this space looks like versus what it actually looks like. So when we talk about it now, of course, we sort of say file sharing platforms are a problem and tools with encryption are a problem, but we sort of treat them like they're siloed. That YouTube is addressing this or that, Facebook is dealing with this. Well, ultimately, they're all interconnected. And it's not just about file sharing, videos, messaging, social media. It goes so much deeper than that because we start to see things where you're using a VPN to access your social media account, to share information about your Telegram handle, where you are sharing something from a video that you were sent to a friend on another app. I mean, you can go around and around in circles. But if you look at the U.S. legal cases alone of people who are arrested, indicted, or convicted on terrorism-related charges, you see that their online engagement is not monolithic. For example, Mohammed Qais, he traveled to IS-controlled territory. In his trial, he claimed that he only ever bought an ice cream there, which is his material support. Interesting, because he was using VPNs, he was using Tor browser, and he was using burner Twitter accounts that he basically used to connect with other people and then got rid of. On completely different case, we had Zubia Shanaz. Zubia Shanaz basically was playing with cryptocurrencies and had $85,000. Some of it was obtained through credit card fraud, but she was trying to support the Islamic State by sending cryptocurrencies to shell companies. We have Kiona Thomas, who was talking to 3 different people with both Twitter and Skype. These are just a few of the cases, but none of their digital footprints are the same. I think that that's something so critical to recognize when you start to look, or as every sort of state starts to look at their own problems and how it pertains to the rest of the world. So sort of, as I said, while we think that they're very siloed, it's so interconnected. And if we can start to adopt this interconnectivity, how might that improve our solutions? So the next challenge that I really want to address is something that we've started talking about today a couple of times, which makes me really excited. So in delivering the message and sort of talking about the tool, it's not so much about the narrative itself, but so in addition to the concrete medium, other challenges that arise is the delivery of messages. Namely, what do you do when a significant portion of the content disseminated by violent extremists does not violate community standards, does not violate anybody's terms of service, and certainly does not violate the law? I did a URL study of all of the URLs that we collected from a big data set. So we had about 250,000 URLs that we decided to analyze, and not the vast majority, but a huge segment of them were actually just news stories. It's not illegal to share news stories. But what a lot of the news stories were doing when you sort of open up the link and look at what they're sharing is validating the persecution of the Ummah, or talking about the failure of the United States or the coalition. So it is validating and sort of adding to extremist rhetoric, but we can't sort of moderate it in the same way that we talk about moderating other extremist content. These are some recent examples that I have from a study I wrote with a colleague, but they were talking about the forest fires in 2017 in the US and framing it as religious retribution. I mean, what can we sort of do? Because that, especially in the United States, for example, is not anywhere close to being illegal. And also, that would not violate a company's terms of service. So starting to look at this, and I think it's a really critical question for us to discuss, because a significant portion of content shared by extremists is not conventional propaganda. Increasingly, especially because the top-down part of the organization is under pressure, we're seeing more and more organic propaganda, or they'll take the framework or edit on images, and sort of all of these are examples of what you might see. And if you're more interested in this, I'd be happy to share a piece we worked on. But ultimately, the gray zone between problematic terrorist content and the material that is suitable for the public highlights the need for methods that complement content removal. So we'll cruise through. So next I'm going to sort of get into the idea of marginalization and what marginalization really allows us to do. I think one of the major missteps that we've had is treating extremism like it's a rudimentary threat, when it's something that is in its very nature. Was that a ping from? Oh, I thought I was being buzzed. But I think that what we need to do is sort of realize that this isn't an existential threat unless we treat it as such. And rolling back our speech and our stances on, what we can do to get an account online. And all of these things are things we need to pay attention to. But as terrorists fight for the cause in the digital sphere, governments and their partners need to be excited about embracing broader and more comprehensive approaches that marginalize the effects of violent extremism online. The political and tactical reliance of content removal inadvertently aggrandizes terrorists, validates extremist narratives of abuse, and polarizes vulnerable communities. In other words, actions really do speak louder than words. And if we're trying to address a group that has made its bones from its early days to its Al-Qaeda days to the latest iteration, these groups are built on the idea that somebody's telling them how to live their life or deciding how or when they can speak. I think that that's critical to understanding how we can sort of navigate our relationship with these with these adversaries. But to develop a more appropriate and sustainable response to terrorist use of digital communications technologies, we must explore additional methods that complement takedowns. I think we've made tremendous strides in this arena. There's an organization called Tech Against Terrorism, and I know Marc is here today, who helps oversee their great work. But basically what Tech Against Terrorism has been doing, and this is a very small shop within the UN, and I swear this isn't a shameless plug, it's something I truly believe in. It's a small group that's been taking tremendous strides in helping tech companies communicate with each other about best practices, including what goes beyond content removal. We see Twitter is making great strides and has set the standard for promoting transparency. As tech companies come to the table, how can we keep encouraging that as states and incentivize transparency in their development of new initiatives? On top of that, starting to look at how we can start connecting that online and offline in terms of promoting programming that sort of transcends both of those arenas or tries to connect resources in that capacity. So while governments cannot abdicate their role in marginalizing the salience of online extremism, political leaders might laud the participation of corporations for this industry-led forums and industry-led leadership, as opposed to telling tech companies explicitly what to do in terms of content removal or promotion of counter-narratives. I think that we can get so much more creative than that, and we're starting to see that. YouTube has started doing very fascinating stuff, and I think just the opportunities here for not just counterterrorism, but for good governance as a whole is something we need to be taking advantage of. By marginalizing tools that enable radicalization and mobilization and reducing the exposure to problematic actors and content, and then lastly, mitigating the polarizing nature of extremist violence, policymakers and practitioners can certainly depreciate the hold extremists have online. So thank you so much.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank Ms. Alexander for her very interesting presentation on the use of the internet and technological resources by terrorist groups and organizations, and how they make use of their resources in their work. I don't know if we have any time for questions. I apologize because I myself will have to leave the room for another meeting, so my colleague will substitute me.
Nous allons donc
As a result of a lack of time, we have reached the end of our third session, so we'll move to the fourth session, and I do understand that in that fourth session there will be time for a more interactive discussion. So we'll just have a very brief break so as to allow the next panelists to take to the podium. Thank you.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. During the final session, panelists will discuss ways to strengthen public-private sector engagement in countering terrorist narratives both online and offline, including with respect to the Tech Against Terrorism Initiative and the work of the industry-led Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. I welcome the experts participating in the final session. Each panelist will make a presentation and, where possible, I ask that you do not exceed the 12-minute limit. I shall now give the floor to the ICT coordinator of CTED, Mr. Marc Porret.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to present this afternoon the project Tech Against Terrorism, a project launched by CTED but implemented by partners, first the ICT for Peace Foundation and now the SecDev Foundation by a team based in London. I will use my time to present some of the challenges and complication and solution that we would like to propose to the committee and the member states on this topic. We have heard so far that terrorists are indeed very good at using technology and using several platforms for that. We have seen already several presentation videos and images of the type of content and the type of platform that are being used. And we know that terrorists are using the new technologies not only for propaganda, radicalization, recruitment, but also for operation, using encrypted app for planning attacks. And we have also concern about future threats such as the use of blockchain and cryptocurrencies and potentially attack on critical infrastructures. Audrey, I think, made a really good presentation in terms of the ecosystem that the different platforms are. The problem here is that we're not only talking about the big firms, but a lot of smaller companies that are abused. Here on this slide, you can see out of about 12,000 pieces of propaganda that have been produced by ISIL from 2014 to 2018, that the content produced by ISIL can be found in a lot of small platforms, many of which I'm sure you have not heard of. And if we were to redo the same study next year, some of the names would be different. So it's a ongoing, changing situation. What we have seen also today is that we're not talking only about violent content, which, and I'll get back to this later on my presentation, is a challenge when you want to automatize and use AI or machine learning to detect content. Another challenge is that we have many stakeholders in this arena. Mentioned the hundreds, if not thousands, of companies which are involved, but also all our member states who have legitimate concern and jurisdiction to try to take action. But how to do that in such a decentralized system? How can traditional law adapt to such and scale to such a problem? So I would like to propose that there is several ways in which we can see social change in this area. So of course we have traditional law that our member states are developing, directives or treaties that at the regional level we can see, and here at the UN, resolutions and treaties. There's also the role of social norms or corporate social responsibilities, the fact that companies feel that they have a responsibility to do something. There could be also disruptive new technology that force companies to adapt. And finally, there is market forces, the fact that if companies are not taking action, they may see the market capitalization of their companies going down, or they may see a flee of some of their users to other platforms because those users feel the platform is not secure, or they don't want their kids to go on the platform they don't feel is secure. What we see also in the last few years is that more and more states are asking companies to take action. They're delegating to companies the responsibility to monitor the content on their own platform. There were mentioned, for example, this morning of the new German act on social media, which is requesting companies to have some form of self-regulation. So our proposal here is that we need better public and private partnership between states and the private sector. And CTED and its initiative, Tech Against Terrorism, have indeed worked with several companies, states, in this area. The way we see it is that we need to work with states, with law enforcement, multilateral organizations and regional organizations, but also cities and mayors, the big companies which are not part of JFCT, and other companies around the globe, and in particular startup companies, small companies. Finally, it's important to engage with civil society, academia, who is doing all the research on the impact of CVE measures, and the CVE practitioners. In terms of our mandate in this area, CTED started to really seriously look at those issues with the renewal of its mandate in 2013, which started consultation with the private sector, and more recently with Resolution 2354, the International Framework to Counter Terrorist Narrative described Tech Against Terrorism as a good practice, and then recently 2395 and 96 recognized the work of Tech Against Terrorism. So it started in 2016. We held a series of consultation on 3 continents. What were the conclusions of our consultation? That what we are doing in terms of controlling and moderating content should be in compliance with international human rights, that it should be evidence-based. And I think that on this, since 2016, we see much more studies. And the CTC in the last 3-4 years, each year have been asked CTED to come up with a new, to prepare for the CTC a special meeting on this topic, and we brought experts. And I think that we start to see more and more research coming up, and in terms of what is and what is not working in this field. Another conclusion, and that's something that we have heard a lot today also, is the fact that we cannot study what is going on online in the vacuum, and we have to look at what is going on offline. And finally, the realization that smaller companies do not have, obviously, the capacity of large internet firms. So what we have done with our implementing partner is engage with different stakeholders, states and the private sector around the globe. And here you can see some of the activities and engagement we had in 2017. In 2018, we also launched the initiative Take Against Terrorism for the Middle East region in Abu Dhabi. That was a few weeks back. We have now engaged with several hundred companies. You see some of them here, some states and regional organizations, some representative of civil society organizations and human rights groups, some who indeed are expressing concerns about those issues, but we think it's important that we listen to what they have to say. Academia, and I'd like to mention the work we try to do with the Global Research Network in terms of keeping a pace in terms of those new trends. I mentioned this issue of outreach to the private sector. Once you outreach to them, you want to share good practices with them and see how they can be provided with capacity. So we have been, and this is something we need to mention. We're working with the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, but we're different from the GIFCT. Our outreach is really to companies globally, and trying to share good practices and solutions. So the process is that we are developing right now is to come up with some form of a risk assessment that the participating company can do to try to mitigate the risk and provide some tools such as terms of service creator and a pledge. And once the companies go through this, they could use a trust mark. So the idea is that the companies have to complete the assessment tool, accept the pledge of TAT, they commit to explicitly prohibit terrorist content, commit to improve the transparency reporting on what they are doing, confirm the ability to receive and take action on takedown requests, and explore how new technology can be used. We launched also in November a website, thanks to the support of the Republic of Korea, called the knowledge sharing platforms, where we have some information that the participating company can use. In terms of the assessment tool, it has been developed for 4 types of companies: content storage, communication and messaging, fintech, and social media company. So there's a questionnaire. In terms of service, what the project has done is a comparative analysis of the terms of service of several different companies. So when a new company wants to have its own terms of service, they can see how the rest of the industry is tackling the issue. We've been working also with the monitoring team of 1267 in terms of sharing with the private sector some information about the proscribed groups, the terminology used by those organizations. In terms of transparency report, this is a tool we believe is very useful in terms of understanding what the private sector is doing, and in terms of future research also. If we're able to know how the industry is reacting, how it is reacting on its own, whether it's reacting in reaction to requests from states. In terms of future project, there is the idea of having a terrorist content alert platforms. The idea is that participating company would be receiving regular intelligence in terms of potential attacks against their platforms. So, for example, if there is a discussion on the dark web among terrorists about which is the best platforms to broadcast a message, then the company could be informed, okay, we believe that there may be a major dump on your platform. Be prepared to have to review the content they will upload. Final point I would like to raise is the question of using technology to fight technology. So the issue of how could we use, for example, machine learning to flag content. And this is an area in which there's been a lot of discussion recently. In March, the Tech Against Terrorism Initiative launched the Data Science Network. It was initial discussion where they brought some experts to brainstorm in terms of how could the technology be used. So, of course, there's the issue of audio and image automatic recognition, but we can use technology for other purposes, such as suspicious activity report, or eventually how to evaluate counter-narrative campaign. So on this point, my last slide, I would just say that in terms of the use of the technology itself, we have to be careful in terms of making sure it is used in a proportionate way, in compliance with the rule of law and international human rights law standards, that we should have an open process of discussion with the different actors in terms of the risk and benefits of the use of AI and machine learning, and that it should be done in a transparent way. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I will leave it there, but later on I will be glad to take any question the participant may have. Thank you.
Microphone for the chairman, please. I thank Mr. Porret for his presentation. I would also like to greet Ms. Koenigs, the Executive Director, who has joined us. Your participation is indeed very important for us. I would now like to give the floor to the head of social network policy at Facebook, Ms. Erin Marie Saltman, representing the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, who is joining us via video conference. Ms. Saltman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the United Nations for hosting us. I'm so sorry I could not be there in person, and also a large thank you to the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate for coordinating this with us and our companies to be able to be here today, despite not being there physically in person. I'm going to attempt to share my screen to share some slides with you. Somebody just wave their hand dramatically if it doesn't work, or give me a thumbs up so that I can tell that it is in fact working, since I can't see there in the room with you. But you should see a large Facebook logo. That's a sign that it's going in the right direction. And just could somebody let me know when that's actually presenting? Yes? Marc, maybe you could give a big thumbs up if it's working. I can see you. Excellent. Good news. So to continue, my role is specifically on the topic of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism at Facebook. I cover Europe, the Middle East, and Africa as a region for policy. And I want to talk very briefly within my time limitations around what Facebook is doing, and then what we can do more collaboratively, not just across industry, but also across sectors. And really, there are two parts to this problem. One part is about the content takedown. How are we defining and identifying illegal content and content that is supporting and praising terrorist-related activities? That is attacking a symptom. We're seeing that on our different platforms. The other part of this really is about the narrative. How can we attack the root causes of violent radicalization? And that is where the talk about counter speech and counter narratives is so crucial. It starts with standards. We all have different standards for our platforms. I'm very pleased that in the last few weeks, Facebook moved to make its community standards much more transparent. So I encourage everyone to look at Facebook's community standards, and it really gives a lot more nuance behind our policies for how we're defining things, how we define terrorism, criminality, dangerous organizations. We have policies that really have to cover almost every topic that governments are also covering. We cover everything from bullying and harassment to hacked accounts to deceased members. A lot of these topics are not specific to my team, but we do cover quite a few. We do cover violent groups. In some cases, we're covering the fringes of hate speech, since many of these groups use different types of speech and language that we have to understand, and harmful activity more broadly. And when it comes to violent extremism policy, it's very important that we have a policy that very explicitly says that violent organizations should not have a presence on our platforms, that you should not be able to praise, support, or represent yourself as those organizations, and we don't allow the celebration or promotion of graphic violence. The enforcement of this is threefold. We do rely on non-Facebook entities. We rely on our community to flag things to us. Some governments also have official internet referral units that will flag content to us. And then behind the scenes, it is a combination of human expertise and machine learning technology. We really do continue to need both. And in many cases, it's how machines do what machines do best and humans do what humans do best, that we can be really optimal behind the scenes. And what that looks like in some cases is around photo and video matching technology. So once we know that there's a terrorist narrative or an official piece of IS propaganda, we can actually hash that image like the equivalent of a digital fingerprint. And the machine learning technology can flag as soon as that content is uploaded. Now, in some cases, that means that the image will never even hit the platform. If somebody is raw uploading terrorist content, then there's no reason to have it. In other cases, if somebody's posting with content around it, we want to know why. We want to know if it's actually the BBC posting or an activist or somebody using counter speech. And so this is a triage system between machine and human expertise, where that content would then be automatically queued for human review. We also do things like fanning out, a network analysis. When you look at processes of radicalization, they really are rarely, if ever, in a complete and utter individual silo. We know that just like in offline communities, radicalization online also takes place within small communities and groups. So we do look at multiple factors. When we take down an account for supporting global terrorist initiatives, we can surface a small group around them based on common traits and conversations and triggers so that we can review that network that's surrounding that individual. And behind that, we have a huge team. We have over 200 people at Facebook where the majority or their entire job is just on counterterrorism efforts. And that has to include a team with a lot of different language expertise that are living and working on different time zones. So really, this is not a case that we have to wake up and wait for California in order for us to action things quickly. And this also cannot happen in a silo just at Facebook. So whether we're talking about research so that we understand the threat and are constantly innovating around that, or whether this is about training other types of stakeholders, whether it's other platforms, whether that are NGO individuals making counter-speech content, or whether it's education programs, even for law enforcement, we have to work with a lot of different sectors in order to be efficient. One of those partnerships, as mentioned, is the Tech Against Terrorism Initiative, which I'll talk more about, and our work through the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, which is the by industry for industry effort to make this happen. But a lot of this also is about training activists and civil society actors to have better voice online so that when they are trying to undermine and challenge extremism and hate speech, they can do it effectively and at scale. So when we're talking about the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, this was launched nearly 1 year ago, founded by Facebook, Microsoft, YouTube, and Twitter. And really our goal is to prevent terrorists from exploiting our platforms. And this takes place in 3 different ways. One of that is through joint tech innovation. So when I talk about that photo and video matching technology, we're actually sharing that and working with a variety of different platforms so that they can incorporate that within their own systems. So we have 13 different companies that are onboarded in that joint hash sharing technology, and that database has over 80,000 unique hashes of terrorist-related content. That helps us find, detect, and scrape our platforms very quickly so that we can deter that usage. The other side of what we're doing is knowledge sharing. The larger companies have a longer history of talking to each other ad hoc. But part of what the GIFCT does is it gives a larger infrastructure to share our knowledge with other platforms and receive knowledge from other platforms. So sometimes we learn a lot from speaking with smaller and medium tech platforms through our engagements with the Tech Against Terrorism Initiative, so that we're not working in a silo again and seeing that other people are solving for the same issues in really innovative ways. And finally, we have a structure for conducting and funding research. A lot of time research will just focus on 1 or maybe 2 platforms that are operating in 1 or maybe 2 countries. But actually, for us to be effective and develop our policy and tooling effectively, we need to see the trend more globally. We need to map out that ecosystem, just as one of our previous panelists showed how messy it can get. We need to see where the next threat is. And it looks very different in Southeast Asia compared to Europe, compared to America. And we need to understand that differentiation. We do at Facebook specifically have a lot of tools and toolkits to help NGOs and civil society groups to find their voice through counterspeech. One is through our nonprofits page, just to try to teach activists how to raise awareness, how to activate supporters, or even just learning the basics. Sometimes using ads marketing tools is not very inherent or intuitive for a lot of these organizations that would benefit from using it. We also developed, outside of nonprofit work, a specific page for counterspeech. It talks through learnings around hackathons, talks about where our next NGO trainings are, and a variety of resources and research that's created just to help people develop their voice online to undermine hate speech and extremism. So with that, I think that's a lot of food for thought. So I will leave it there for now, and I look forward to fielding questions.
I thank Ms. Saltman for her presentation. I now give the floor for technical reasons, we will have to skip one session. And so with that, I give the floor to the Director of Legal Affairs and Trust and Safety of Vimeo, Mr. Sean McGilvray. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you to CTED for organizing this today. This has been a really great event. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm very proud to be representing Vimeo here and be able to share a little bit of our perspective. Ironically, for someone who's here representing a video hosting platform, I am not a very visual person, so I don't have a pretty PowerPoint slide deck for you all to look at. Because I am just going with my voice and mindful that at the end of the day, I'll try to be as brief and engaging as I can within those limitations. So I'm here to represent Vimeo. We are a video hosting platform. For those of you that don't know, the tagline that I like to use is, if you think of YouTube for hipsters, you're not too far off the mark. We are a video hosting platform that grew up originally as a place for creative filmmakers. It got started by a couple of friends who just wanted to share their videos online with a premium player experience. So they created technology to share an ad-free premium experience. And over the years, that basis has led to what is largely a community of creative professionals who want a platform to share their, what I like to call, intentional videos. We're talking about documentaries, pieces of journalism, narrative films, art films. You won't see too much, raw footage of like a cat sliding off a kitchen counter, which is hilarious, but not really something that fits in our platform. And I explain that because it sort of lays the background to how we deal with extremist content, terrorist content, and all the other sorts of bad stuff that we've been here discussing all day, and that can kind of creep in. Vimeo has 70 million members in 150 countries. It's sort of that small to medium-sized company. So we deal with a lot of the same problems that other sort of open user-generated content platforms deal with, but we tackle them with a lot less in the way of resources than some of the other companies have. The trust and safety team at Vimeo, which I am the head of, is broadly responsible for enforcing our terms of service and community guidelines. So that means we do deal with terrorist content, propaganda, but we also deal with spam, fraud, sextortion, copyright infringement, trademark infringement, you name it. Basically anything that might get Vimeo blocked, sued, or embarrassed in a news story falls into our remit. And the trust and safety team that we have is small enough that we couldn't field one side in a soccer or football match. So we're doing all this with very limited resources. And that is definitely one of the challenges that, companies on the smaller side that haven't, reached the same level of broad, watchword internet company status have to deal with. It's a question of scale. We're vastly outnumbered by the number of bad actors out there who like to upload extremist propaganda. They're always going to be more dedicated to it than we are. That said, I don't know anyone in the user-generated platform space who wants to be a home for extremist content or for propaganda or for these users to spread their message. I think I've seen in specific instances and in general instances that, we're all on the same page in wanting to be good partners with member states and civil society and other NGOs and people who are working to combat that on a number of fronts. And so that's one way that we do meet that challenge of scale is through participation in things like the GIF-CT and with organizations like Tech Against Terrorism that lead to ways for there to be true knowledge sharing between the larger platforms that might have the bigger tech base and the smaller platforms that can take that and run with it. Another challenge that we run into being on the smaller end is a matter of context. Like I said, we're a small team. We're based in the US. We don't necessarily have subject matter experts. Some of the bigger companies, they'll have separate teams for policy, operations, content moderation, community support outreach, and they'll have different people handling everything. We are a team of generalists, and that means we often lack a little bit of specific knowledge and depth when it comes to a specific subject matter area. A video might get flagged up to us, and it's in a language that we don't understand, referring to historical events that we have no knowledge of, using veiled language or code words that even somebody within the culture that produced it might have trouble picking up on that. Add to that the fact that we see that in our flagged queue, for a few seconds before having to make at least a first level decision of remove, keep up, or escalate for higher review. So you can see how that might be very challenging. And that is one thing that being able to take part in a knowledge sharing platform is really instrumental with. And that ties into another way that we meet those challenges is working closely with IRUs or Internet Referral Units. We work pretty closely with just a bunch of them all over the world. Some come in from specific IRUs. Some come in as takedown notices from law enforcement agencies within a member state. Some are worded nicer than others, but all of them sort of provide at least a little bit of context. Let us know what we're looking at. Let us know the provenance of a video or image, and give us the information we need to review them against our terms of service and make the decision that this is something we don't want on our platform. One troubling aspect, though, of working with poking around at the edges of hate speech and, other areas where we might run into things beyond just a notification that a video might violate your terms of service. When there's a threat of being blocked or, having users unable to access Vimeo for a certain period of time, that incentivizes us to over-remove, which, as we've seen people mention all throughout the day, can be very deleterious when it comes to fostering counter speech. Our platform is home to a lot of great filmmakers and journalists who go out of their way to make really insightful documentaries, exploring the effect of conflict in places like Aleppo, and really zeroing in on humanistic stories where even if it's not a counter narrative in the sense that it's designed to counter propaganda, just being able to report freely and discuss on events as they happen is very important and really protects that human right of freedom of expression, which is a part of our terms of service, a part of our guidelines, and a part of our sort of foundational bedrock principles. Another reason, and you've heard this mentioned as well, or another aspect that we use to meet challenges that you've heard discussed today as well, is sort of machine learning or algorithmic detection. This has been a huge part, and a lot of it has been stuff that, or has been techniques that we've learned from other platforms and cooperated with. In certain respects, it's easier to deal with extremist propaganda by looking at the characteristics of the account that is uploading it, because the way that account acts will clue you in a lot quicker in many cases than having to review the content of the video. As I mentioned, there are sometimes problems figuring out the context. That's not always the case. Daesh, IS, others are very good at branding, so they do make it easy on us to very easily recognize their content, but that's not always the case. But if we look at, is this user on a throwaway IP address? Are they using a remailer service? Are they using, an email that hops through 2 or 3 other connectors? Are they doing these very specific things to obscure their point of origin? If so, they're probably not someone we want on the platform. And a lot of that is stuff that we actually adopted in response to spam. Pure Viagra Cialis, click here malware spam. We found that by profiling what the users who upload that look like, we were able to actually take action on that. And that extended pretty well to extremist propaganda because they use a lot of the same proxies and a lot of the same remailers and a lot of the same obscuring techniques. So that's been helpful for us, but no amount of algorithmic detection will let someone, review a documentary and try to decide, like, is this a counter narrative? Is this, speaking out against atrocity or celebrating it? There's no way that you can train a machine to make those decisions. You will always need an element of human moderation. And that is why, those initiatives that have been mentioned already are so important. As was said in the last panel, nothing operates in a vacuum. These bad actors are tweeting to a video that includes a link to a Facebook group in the description, and that Facebook group, has links to another forum on an encrypted messaging app. And being able to share intelligence between us, I think, is going to be incredibly important in providing a unified front to making sure that we're sweeping our doorstep and keeping our platforms as unfriendly to extremist content as possible. And with that, I think I'll wrap it up for the day.
I thank Mr. McGilvray for his presentation, and I would like to warmly thank all of the panelists for their interesting presentations and productive participation. Following the presentations, I would now like to open the floor for comments and questions. In the interest of time, I would like to remind all participants to make their questions and comments briefly, and the full text of their statements can be sent to the CTED for inclusion on the website. Statements can be sent to the CTED email address, cted@un.org. In a first round, I will give the floor to members of the CTC. And I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. Our thanks to the CTED for once again having organized an excellent public meeting of the committee, and our thanks to all of the panelists on all of the panels since this morning for their presentations. They have all been very interesting. On the subject of the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, and above all, how to prevent that use, which is of course a priority for France, I'm not going to go into detail in our position that everybody knows very well, but this is a subject that we have worked on constantly, whether at in our national capacity, in the United Nations, also within the European Union, and also within the G7 and the G20. The way that the private sector and internet enterprises have mobilized over the last few years is, of course, something that we very much welcome and which we also try to encourage. As we see it, some progress still needs to be made, in particular in communication and transparency among governments and companies, and in particular when it comes to the use of some of the tools that have been mentioned today, I think in particular by the representative of Facebook, and in particular I'm talking about the use of databases. But it is certain that we are moving in the right direction and that we need to continue down that path. My question focuses mostly on the interaction between these major companies, in particular those that created the Global Internet Forum, Facebook, Google, among others, and then smaller companies. And we have an example of that today with us in the form of the representative of Vimeo. It's very interesting to see what challenges you face. How can the Global Forum work more with these smaller companies to help them face up to these challenges? And how, from the point of view of smaller companies, can we do better in this area so as to ensure that what has been developed in the framework of the Global Forum can be disseminated more broadly, used more widely, and produce results? Thank you. I thank the representative of France. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. And once we've heard from the other members of the CTC, the briefers will answer all of the questions together. So the Russian Federation has the floor. Thank you, Chairman. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Executive Director of the CTC and Ms. Koenigs personally for organizing today's briefing. The Russian Federation actively supported the idea of including a mandate in the relevant Security Council resolution to hold annual meetings on the subject of combating terrorist propaganda. The work of the CTED is extremely relevant in this regard. Technology against terrorism, as well as other projects with which the CTED cooperates. We've heard many interesting presentations, including over the last two sessions, and it's difficult to comment on all of them. And so I'll perhaps focus on one company. In particular, I would like to hear some more comments from Ms. Saltman, and I hope that she's still on the line with us. And I'd like to ask her some questions because she represents not just Facebook, but also the Global Forum to Combat Terrorism, to Counter Terrorism. My first question concerns conditions of confidentiality and the external policy of Facebook. Today, a new classification of content was presented to us, content that Facebook considers to be unacceptable. Of course, in the CTC, the majority of states are in favor of the timely deletion and blocking of terrorist content and countering that, because this content is universally deleterious, harmful, and illegal in almost every country. At the same time, I have to note that one of the types of prohibited content is insulting humor. And so it would be interesting to hear about how this approach chimes with the company's position on freedom of speech and how the method of working on extremist content chimes with this as well. Secondly, I'd like to ask about cooperation with state structures. As you said, the company works with law enforcement agencies which contain internet referral units. And we would be grateful to have more information from you about which countries in particular you're talking about, which regions, and how you interact with state structures if these internet referral units don't exist. And my last question concerns the activities of the Global Internet Forum, and I think that the colleague from Vimeo can also shed some light on this as well. As was said, the forum interacts with certain companies. I think primarily those are companies from small and medium business. So could you tell us specifically which companies you are talking about and which regions these companies represent? Thank you. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his comments and questions. I now give the floor to the delegation of the United States.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you to Executive Director Konings for joining us today at this very important special meeting. I think one of the key issues that we addressed was the importance of the network, which was also addressed with Ms. Saltman, who I hope is still on the line as well. And I think that the role of the network in both online and off is very significant. And we're very interested to hear how this network and the role of the private sector, civil society, academia, how each of these actors really contribute. And I think that's what is so important about today's meeting, having all of these actors together in one room, not only governments, but the other relevant actors who actually engage with the community on the ground. And so we commend CTED for having this open briefing on that in that respect. Additionally, we applaud the efforts of the Global Internet Forum as well as Tech Against Terrorism, and especially the knowledge sharing platform. We highlight that this is very significant, and we hope to continue to see progress in this realm, particularly with smaller companies. The United States is very interested in continuing our collaboration with the private sector, civil society, and academia, but particularly we believe that censorship is not the answer. This is something that's been discussed throughout the different sessions, and we wanted to highlight a couple of thoughts. So our policy, as outlined in our presidential executive order on strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure, states that we promote an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that fosters efficiency, innovation, communication, and economic prosperity, while respecting privacy and guarding against disruption, fraud, and theft. This is a long-standing policy that the United States promotes around the world, and one that is shared by many of our allies and partners, both governments as well as civil society and academics. So oftentimes, therefore, our approach when we do pursue it is we take great care to ensure that we don't engage directly or indirectly in censorship that is inconsistent with our international human rights obligations or commitments. The consequences of doing otherwise are dire. Loss of trust, alienation, feelings of abuse and injustice against the government are all conditions that are known as drivers of violent extremism. We have seen counterterrorism being used by some governments as a pretext to crush political dissent and opposition, or eliminate groups that are troubling for one reason or another. In fact, we actually view doing so as counterproductive. Some governments may do so, but we believe that alternative viewpoints are more effective in responding to this issue. And we also believe that responsible providers, such as Facebook and other companies who are very active with tech against terrorism, are often best placed to do so. Having a resilient society is very important. And so as we heard from the various briefers today, there are 3 things that the United States would really like to work on and are very keen to work with the actors here today. The first is to train teachers, to engage students on violent extremism issues through videos and discussion. Perhaps we could work with Vimeo on something of that sort. The second is to promote digital literacy and critical thinking among youth nationally. One thing I noticed today is that there aren't many youth organizations represented in the room. For us, it's very important to have those people that we're actually trying to target in the room. We may not be able to bring the terrorists, obviously, of course, to our meetings, but it might be helpful to see how those actors who are trying to engage actually participate in the decision-making and creation of the policies we discuss. The third is developing intervention programs that empower families, schools, social workers, and peers to refer students who may be showing signs of radicalization to violence. So overall, we would like to continue our ongoing voluntary collaboration with both governments as well as the private sector. And we believe that there may be governments who are frustrated with technology companies who may think that not enough is being done. But we do have strong faith in the tech against terrorism and among the private companies that are working together. And so before taking any action, we really do highlight the importance of considering very carefully whether that action is consistent with international law and human rights obligations. The one question that I'd like to pose to the various briefers is when we talk about this network and how we engage with different companies and how we develop our different processes for taking down content, how do the different companies balance human rights concerns? Because I think that's a very important concern and would really like to hear more on that. Thank you.
I thank the US delegation for their comments. Are there any further questions from committee members? Questions or comments from committee members? If not, then I will give the floor to the briefers to answer questions and to give any additional comments if they have any. Who shall we start with? Let's go in the same order as the initial presentations. With that, I give the floor to Mr. Porret.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be short. There were several questions related to the link between GIFCT and the small companies, and that's something on which our two representative from the industry can speak, but what I can say is that Tech Against Terrorism has been actually working really closely with GIFCT in terms of this outreach to the smaller companies. So the different activities of Tech Against Terrorism to reach out to the private sector in different continents, in different cities. We do it together with the GIFCT. So the idea is that established companies can share their practices with smaller companies, and that's the kind of partnership that we have in terms of knowledge sharing with the GIFCT. I would comment also on the question of use, which came up also early on. I think it's a fair point that. In the future, we need to take this issue at more seriously, and the same way that we in CTED have been working on mainstreaming issues such as gender and new technologies. The question of use is of importance. I can say that within our office, we are working actively on this issue of use, for example, on the question of returnees and our new resolution 2395/96, the importance of involving use. And I think that in future activities, especially on this topic of counter-narrative, will make additional efforts to propose to the CTC to have representatives of use organizations. I think I'll leave it there on my side.
Thank you, Mr. Porret. Ms. Saltman, you have the floor. There were a few questions that were specifically put to you.
Yes, well, thank you for the questions. They're much appreciated. I took notes because there are quite a few questions, I think, and some implied. I'll go through them in the order that they came just to make sure I address them. But to be quick, with relation to the question from the French delegate, you asked about how GIFCT is working with smaller companies and how we can work more broadly and robustly with those companies. To be sure, that is one of the larger focuses of GIFCT work. Although this was founded by 4 larger companies, we realized that we were having very ad hoc discussions about the topic of terrorism for the last 4 or 5 years. So we'd had informal structure around these dialogues cross-industry. And we realized it really was not effective enough because we saw that we only get part of the ecosystem. In Audrey's presentation, she showed that people hop between one platform and another. So only by having a network across industry, large and small, do we get the full picture. And we also realized it's important that we can't expect smaller and medium companies just to come to us. It's really important that we have partnered with Tech Against Terrorism because they represent a third party. We don't want it to seem like Facebook or a Google are going to smaller companies and demanding that they comply with how we're doing things. We have worked with Tech Against Terrorism for them to centralize a lot of information about how we have come to try to tackle these challenges so that we can share that knowledge more centrally. But we're also holding these workshops with Tech Against Terrorism and the Global Internet Forum in different parts of the world. So last year we held workshops in New York, San Francisco, Jakarta, Paris, Brussels. And this year we started it off by holding one in Abu Dhabi. We'll be in Australia later in June. So we're going to the regions and connecting and creating a network with small and medium platforms that exist in those regions and proactively reaching out to them and inviting them to come to the table. We're not there to force people. We're not there to try to seem like we're bullying people to come to the table, but a lot of these platforms are very concerned, and this provides a safe space for them to understand the threat that they're facing a little bit better and then talk through potential solutions. When we talk about the hash sharing database, you also asked about transparency. We've published a few different blog posts as well as on the GIFCT website about what we're trying to develop and how we're trying to develop it. And so we've been very open. We've also been very grateful that certain international government bodies have come to the table to help us evolve this. So Europol, for example, presented us with their database of terrorist-related hashes so that we could add that to the work that we're doing with the shared hash database. So this is very important as a by-industry, for-industry effort, but one that governments can really help us advance with, because sometimes you're going to know how the threat is evolving even more than we do. With relation to the 3 questions by the delegate from Russia, one was about insulting humor, and I will admit that the team that deals with insulting humor is not my own, although sometimes there is overlap. But I would say that that category is really about at what point does humor become incitement to violence? At what point does humor become dehumanization of a person based on one of their protected categories, such as race, gender, religion, ethnicity. And so that's where we have to have a team that really looks at the cost of language. At what point does language become hate speech? And so there is nuance that is implied within certain humor around slurs and language that can actually cause real world harm. On your second question around cooperation with states and internet referral units, as I mentioned, Europol has an internet referral unit, as do other countries. The UK talks widely about its counterterrorism internet referral unit, so does France. A lot of different governments have different ways of flagging content to us. That can be through the normal channel online on the platform, or it could be through their relations with our regional and national policy leads. But feel free to ask Marc for my email later if you have further questions on that. And then lastly, you asked about GIFCT, what companies we're working with and where. So as I said, we're going to different parts of the world with our workshops and proactively engaging with a huge network of smaller platforms. For the hash sharing consortium, those 13 companies, that includes our larger companies, but it also includes smaller ones like Snap, Just Pasted, Oath, Yellow, quite a large range of different platforms, some of which you might have heard of and some not. Again, we speak about this on the website and have published about the different companies in some of our blog posts. For the US delegation's quick questions, you made a comment on networks, which we agree are important, especially around our work with civil society, not on the takedown side, but on the building counter speech and counter narrative side. One of the largest programs through that has been the Online Civil Courage Initiative, where we've been proactively training activists and civil society groups on how to use the platform and get their voice across better, as well as the peer-to-peer program, which works in universities and which the US Department of State has worked on as well in the US context. But that exists in over 59 different countries in over 250 different universities currently. You also asked, how do different companies balance human rights concerns? Well, one of the ways we do that is by making sure that we have hired very good human rights lawyers and experts, and that we continue to engage with different NGOs and legal teams that deal specifically on human rights as we're developing our policy. So human rights is always at the foremost of our concerns when we're looking at policies and looking at potential negative side effects as we evolve our policy and what the repercussions of that might be within a human rights framework. So that is crucial to keep at the forefront, and it's also something that the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism has kept at its core. Over censorship is a very fine line and a slippery slope, but we make sure that we're consulting with third parties and experts outside of our industries and outside of our networks so that we continue to question our own choices as we progress. So I think I've covered most of that. Again, I'm sure somebody can pass along my email if there's further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Saltman, for those comments in great detail, answering those questions. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. McGilvray.
Thank you. So I'll be brief. I think my colleague from Facebook answered most of what was asked. But just to once again interject that, smaller to medium-sized company perspective, what we would like to see, even more of, there can be, other knowledge sharing platforms, other ways for, state actors, IRUs, whoever else to work in a more coordinated way to be able to provide that context that I mentioned in my earlier remarks that we're often missing. It's easy enough to just report a URL and, say that, oh, this is IS content, but, being able to give us, certain regex stop words we can draw from it, explain what's happening, give a little bit more information on exactly what's happening, can, go over above and beyond even what things like the hash sharing or other data set sharing can do, and what goes hand in hand with that is sort of mapping that network that we've been discussing, and really sort of working together to figure out how we're all connected and sharing that information with each other. That's really probably the most valuable thing I think that initiatives like that provide, that and sort of the sort of modular tools and, different applications that we can plug into our workflow and learn as best practices and tools that can come from longer development cycles and companies with larger resources. And then I would also like to comment on that balance between removing extremist content but still protecting human rights. Specifically with Vimeo being a video sharing platform, we're talking about the right to expression. We're talking about the ability to voice an opinion without automatically being chilled by either an algorithmic detection or an overzealous moderator, or being too in lockstep with other companies and maybe sharing some bad information. So it's always about livening any sort of algorithmic approach with some human oversight, and really leaving it up to individual moderators and members of the trust and safety team to be able to do a high-level review and decide, is this an actual instance of expression? Is it a counter-narrative? Is it a documentary? Does it have journalistic merit? Is it just somebody expressing their feelings in a way that deserves to be heard? And if so, we want to do what we can to protect that while still being good partners. Thanks.
I thank Mr. McGilvray for his answers. Now we can open up the floor on the subject of the meeting to all delegations if they would like to make comments. Before taking the floor, I would like you to introduce yourself.
Пожалуйста.
Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you for giving the opportunity to take the floor. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm from the human rights organisation Article 19. We focus on freedom of expression. My first point is just one of information that today the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression released his annual report, which will be presented to the Human Rights Council next month, which addresses precisely this topic, the issue of government and social media companies' moderation of online content and the interaction between both of those forms. I've just tweeted a link to it from our Twitter account, which is at Article 19 UN. The OHCHR website tends to be a little slow in getting these reports out there, but you can read the recommendations there, which we thoroughly endorse. My first question is both to ICT for Peace and also to Facebook, in relation either to the trust mark or in relation to social media platforms' terms of service more broadly, and the definitions of terrorist content, and really whether as an internet user and as civil society we should trust companies to adopt definitions of terrorist content which perhaps imply a lower threshold for removals than would be permitted of states, and whether we should be asking of social media companies that their terms of service reflect the same that we might want to see from nation states in terms of criminal restrictions on speech. So I'd be interested in reflections on that. I think for us we would prefer to see model terms of service that look much more like international human rights law. That's a position that the Special Rapporteur is favouring in his report that's been released yesterday. And a follow-up question to Facebook on the issue of remedies. When Facebook gets it wrong and perhaps removes content incorrectly, what can the platforms do better, both in terms of providing greater transparency about what the origin was of the request for the removal of content, and also allowing internet users to challenge those decisions and see their content restored? Thank you. Спасибо за комментарий.
Thank you for your comments and questions. Would anyone else like to take the floor for comments or questions? Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this opportunity. My name is Abdurrahman Al-Hamadi. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations. Allow me in the beginning, Mr. Chairman, to express appreciation to the Chair and members of the 1373 Committee for organizing this discussion. I would like to briefly share a relevant experience about public-private partnership. The State of Qatar co-sponsored Resolution 2354 and support the comprehensive international framework to counter terrorist narratives. One form of this support is emphasizing the role of education in countering terrorist narratives. The discussion today has shed light on the fact that the main target of terrorist narratives is youth. Therefore, efforts to counter these narratives should focus, among other issues, on educating youth and providing them with economic opportunities. Qatar views public-private partnerships as key to the success of efforts aimed to counter extremism and terrorist narratives, with particular focus on youth and education. Therefore, much of Qatar's contribution in this regard has come through such partnerships. Here, I would like to mention two examples. First, education above all. A Qatari foundation has recently marked the milestone of securing the final commitments needed to enroll 10 million hard-to-reach children in quality education. Another example of such partnerships is the trilateral agreement between the State of Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, CELATEC, a Qatari institution, and the UN CTED to support the employability of youth in the context of countering terrorism efforts. Finally, in participating in the forthcoming high-level meeting of heads of national counterterrorism agencies, we are planning to highlight partnerships through convening an event in cooperation with Education Above All and Hamad bin Khalifa University on preventing violent extremism through quality education. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the Deputy Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar for his comments and information from his national experience. Are there any further comments or questions? You have the floor.
Thank you so much. My name is Mona Al-Qwidi. I'm from Columbia University and Cairo University. Thanks indeed for CTED and, of course, for CTED Executive Director for having this open meeting for other practitioners and experts and others. I've got a very quick question to all the panelists, actually. You've been talking about the public-private partnership in relation to countering terrorism and the cooperation also with governments. I'm wondering, how do you actually function in a situation in which governments aren't that cooperative in terms of countering terrorism? So, without naming countries, if you're functioning within a country, of course, I mean, whether Facebook or Vimeo or others, that the government isn't actually abiding by many of UN Security Council resolutions, do you cooperate with civil society organizations, with the members of the public? How do you function in that? Thank you.
I give the floor to the woman in the second to last row.
It's working? Okay. Hi, my name is Yara Sair. I'm in NYU and American University of Beirut alum. I'm also founder of Truth Be Told. My question is regarding actually the panel present here today. So a lot has been said about ISIS and Daesh today, and speculation was made by many country representatives, especially from Western and European countries. I was just curious why countries who are directly and most direly affected by such terrorist organizations are not on the panel today, such as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, just to name a few. Though I know they are not CTC member states, it would have been interesting to have them as part of the panel because I believe the only way to effectively counter terrorist narratives and prevent their use of internet, perhaps, is first and foremost by not only listening to, but also understanding the narratives of the countries that mainly these terrorist organizations exist in and flourish from. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. You quite rightly noted that for the broadest possible dialogue, we have these open meetings so that as many member states as possible can express their positions on the subject of the meeting. Are there any further comments or questions? I recognize the lady on my right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Maysoon Aldah from the United Arab Emirates Permanent Mission to the UN. Allow me to speak in Arabic, to give my intervention in Arabic.
At the outset, I would like to thank the CTC and the Executive Directorate for organizing this highly important event. This meeting sheds light on the most important measures that the international community must take to combat terrorist narratives. Mr. Chairman, the UAE has launched a number of policies to combat terrorism. These policies are preventive in their nature and focus on preventing extremism before it becomes violent. I would like to share with you the most important measures and the best practices that we have followed in the UAE to prevent the use of internet by terrorists. The UAE has enacted laws to combat terrorist narratives, among which Action number 2 of 2015. It criminalizes any actions to defame religions. It also criminalizes any dissemination of such information on the internet. We also enacted laws to criminalize the use of internet by terrorists to disseminate their ideologies and to finance its activities. The UAE cooperates with international and regional partners to establish mechanisms to combat terrorist narratives, including through social media. We established Al-Sawab Center to combat ISIS propaganda. Al-Sawab Center promotes tolerance and cooperates with entities that have similar goals, such as Al-Azhar in Cairo. We also have Al-Hidayah Center, an international center to prevent extremism. It aims to provide entities around the world with the tools that enables them to build their capacities to prevent terrorism. In addition, the UAE, in cooperation with the UK and the US, heads the working group as part of the coalition against ISIS. This coalition includes more than 30 countries. We aim to share information and measures to provide an alternative narrative. We also hosted the International Conference to Criminalize Electronic Terrorism in May 2017. This conference aimed to find a common ground to implement legislation, international laws also, that address the use of internet by terrorism. We will also organize an event on this issue on the 27th of June 2018 at the margin of the UN meeting of counterterrorism agencies. Mr. Chairman, Security Council Resolution 2354 addresses the importance of including and engaging with religious scholars and religious leaders. In this regard, in Abu Dhabi, we cooperate with religious scholars to unify our efforts and combat terrorist propaganda. We also have a forum to make sure people understand religion correctly and don't misinterpret certain teachings. In conclusion, the UAE stresses the importance of peaceful coexistence. Our efforts to counter terrorism will not be crowned with success unless different countries take down sites that promote terrorist ideologies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for those comments. I have been informed that the representative of Facebook will soon be forced to end the video conference, so I would like to give her the floor now so that she can give any answers she needs to.
Thank you very much, and sorry that I'll have to jump in a little while, but everything at Facebook, the internet doesn't sleep, so we are constantly on the move. I'll address very quickly the questions that came out in the recent series. Speaking to the representative from Article 19, you asked about trust marks, terms of service, and definitions. Again, I'll point to the fact that our policies now, when you look at our community standards, are much more open and transparent as of just a few weeks ago. So we have our definition of how we're defining violent extremism and terrorism there, and I would appreciate your scrutiny on the policies. Part of the reason to make this more transparent was that we could get better feedback from experts, and we've been talking a lot with academics and experts as well as human rights activists to get that feedback and evolve our policy as needs be. One of the tricky things about being more transparent with your policy is the fact that this is a constantly evolving policy. Different crises that take place around the world or different problems that come to the table that we need to address mean that our policy will continue to evolve. But our definition on terrorism is quite an academic one. It talks about non-state actors carrying out premeditated and strategic violence against person, property, or government for political or ideological aims. It does not specify or is not specific to one religion or ideology. We have individuals and groups on that list from across a wide range of the ideological spectrum. It is not just Islamist extremism. It also includes certain far-right white supremacy groups and far leftist groups. There's some very strange organizations out there in the world carrying out strategic violence when you start defining it. We also refer to the U.S. Department of State's designation lists, as well as the United Nations list, so that we're in line with more recognized and global lists that are evolving as well. So I think that's important, and I would welcome feedback on that. You also asked what happens when we get it wrong. And the other thing that I'm really pleased Facebook has put forward is that there is now a rights to appeal process. So if you do have a piece of content or your profile that gets suspended or taken down, you actually have the right to appeal, and that will go through a double review where it's resent back for us to have a second scrutiny over that. Because as you mentioned, we do get things wrong. And I think we probably learn more from our errors than we do from our successes, as many other industries and individuals do. But having that right to appeal button and process is a really innovative step forward to make sure that there's at least a two-way dialogue on a certain level at scale for us to be able to do this. That has to be regionalized and localized so that it's within specific language and criteria. Again, looking at just slur terms or dehumanizing language, that is very localized, and that is a very evolving space with language as well. So it does take human capacity to be able to do that well. Between last year and this year, we increased our operations teams from about 4,000 to 7,500. And that's going to be over 10,000 by the end of the year. So again, machine learning can do some things really well, but really having localized expertise in language in different parts of the world to understand the nuance behind speech is extremely important. There's a question from a representative coming from Columbia and Cairo University, and you asked about public-private partnerships and how this functions, especially where governments are not cooperative. Again, thankfully, we have teams in different parts of the world that handle specific countries and regions, and how we engage in that country and region is through their advice and consulting. There are some countries where it's really helpful to have government at the table, and some countries where perhaps it's a more hostile dialogue. That should not stop us from engaging proactively and positively within a country or within a region. And we will work with a ton of networked civil society representatives on the ground, both localized as well as international networks that might facilitate those dialogues of progression. So it really depends on where in the world we're talking about. It looks different, and I think it's good that we're able to be flexible and localize our approach to make sure that we're not just refusing to engage just because perhaps a government relation is not as positive as in another country or region. There was also a question from Truth Be Told. You were talking about ISIS and about representation from different areas. I agree. I'm sorry that I'm not specifically born and raised in certain other territories and regions, but I can guarantee you that anytime we have a dialogue that might affect a certain country or region, I'm in contact with the policy leads and managers on the ground, as well as any localized networks of experts that we have. Again, it really is not directed back to Silicon Valley. We have over 85% of our users outside of the US and Canada, so we cannot have just a California-centric approach to how we're evolving this policy and how we're implementing that policy. And just to comment to the UAE representative quickly, I'm happy to say that we work with a lot of the organizations that you mentioned. So we met when we were in our Abu Dhabi engagement to launch GIFCT and the Tech Against Terrorism work in the region. We had Sawab, Etidal, and Hadaya at the table. Again, we need to be working with people that are already doing this work and doing it well on the ground. There's no point for us to try to reinvent the wheel every time we engage in a different part of the world. So looking at existing structures and just seeing how we can upskill and optimize what already exists will definitely be the best way to get impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saltman. Thank you for your answers and for participating in today's meeting. We still have 3 requests for the floor. And with that, we will close the list. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to the lady on my left.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Eleanor, I'm a representative of the EU delegation, and thank you for giving me the floor. Also, thank you to the Chair and the members of the CTC for convening this meeting on such an important issue. We're happy as an EU that this is a priority at the UN, as it remains a priority within the EU as well. I will be brief, so I will take the suggestion to hand in our written, more elaborate statement. Just wanted to highlight or share the practice at EU level, where we have our EU Internet Forum, which brings together interior ministries from across the EU, as well as key representatives from the internet industry. And the forum has 2 key objectives: to reduce accessibility to terrorist content online, and to empower civil society partners to increase the volume of effective alternative narratives. And I'm just happy to notice that as one of the key players in this internet forum is also Europol, that Facebook just acknowledged their cooperation and transparency. So it's good to see that this works on the ground as well. There's more details to share, but I will leave it to our written contribution for others to be able to consult that later on. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the EU delegation. I would now like to give the floor to the lady on my right.
Very much. I'm Helena Grunberg. I'm with the International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN for short. And thank you both to this panel and the previous panels as well. Through ICANN, we spearhead a network called the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, through which we support women-led organizations in various contexts that are using alternative narratives to counter extreme messages. And I wanted to share just one example of the work being done by one of our partners in northern Nigeria that speaks directly to this question of not only challenging existing narratives, but what was mentioned, I think, maybe in the previous panel, but I think possibly in this one too, who is the one doing the challenging, and who are the people listened to, credibility, context, human interaction, and then I do also have a question. So our partner in Nigeria, who's herself a very devout and respected woman in her community, developed this concept that she calls from Boko Haram to Boko Halal. And as you know, of course, one of Boko Haram's key messages is around prohibiting Western education. And so what she did was she identified specific Western peace-building concept and then engaged with Islamic scholars through a couple of larger umbrella organizations in Nigeria, and then came up with what the Quran and Hadith would say about these concepts. And then she published a little manual of teaching peace and peaceful coexistence in Islamic schools. And while the manual is not specifically embedded in the curriculum of the Islamic schools, it serves as a tool for extracurricular activity such as peace clubs taken in the schools. And after the first sort of 15 weeks, and also after, in conjunction to this, she also had this live radio phone-in program where Islamic scholars would speak weekly on topics addressed in the manual, and then people could call in. And after only 15 weeks of running this program, authorities reported a 40% increase of enrollment of children in public schools, and particularly young girls. So this is just to kind of illustrate that alternative narratives do work. And my question to both the panel, the previous panels, and everyone in this room is, how can we work with you? How can we put you in touch with all the wonderful women's organizations that are doing work both in Nigeria, in Iraq? We work with organizations that are doing very similar work in Basra, Iraq. And how do we take these narratives, put them online, and have these kind of be what's out there? And I'm happy to talk to everyone afterwards. Thank you.
I thank the representative of ICANN for her comments and questions. I would now like to give the floor to the delegation of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We would like to thank the CTC and CTED for organizing this meeting and trying to capture various aspects of this very complex phenomenon. I will briefly highlight Turkey's approach to this issue, and as you suggested, the longer version of our statement will be sent to CTED. Countering terrorism has always carried a component of ideological battle against terrorist propaganda. Turkey, who has been fighting various terrorist organizations, PKK, Daesh, and FETÖ, knows this very well. Every terrorist organization produces their own narratives and uses different ideologies to legitimize violence. And the new communication technologies have exacerbated this challenge. Therefore, we believe that the global counterterrorism responses, including in the UN, should have a stronger communications component. We strongly believe in the necessity of a two-pronged approach, which has been mentioned here today. The first part of such a strategy is to deny terrorist groups space for their propaganda, and this is the discussion about taking down content. In Turkey, this is part of our efforts, and for instance, we have closed down dozens of Daesh-linked internet sites. We are also conducting operations against Daesh facilitators, radicalizers, and networks. Secondly, we have to devise smart communication counter-narrative strategies. Yet on this, it is difficult to claim success so far on producing counter-narratives. We believe further scientific research has to be conducted, and we would like to thank the panelists today, especially in the morning, for highlighting the results of their research. We know that the most successful strategic communication campaigns are often those that consider local conditions, and part of this localization strategy should include greater use of local credible voices, as has been also voiced here, instead of governments. In Turkey, With regard to Daesh, for example, we encourage voices of reason to speak up the true meaning of religion. We have promoted role models who can speak about meaningful alternatives to violence, extremism, and terrorism. And let me highlight the role of the Office of Religious Affairs, which plays a special role in Turkey. The office ensures that right information on religions reaches the public, emphasizing the peaceful and tolerant messages of Islam. Last point, I would also like to warn against some approaches aimed at making distinctions between terrorist organizations. A terrorist group is a terrorist group and should not be legitimized because it's fighting another terrorist groups. Such approaches only contribute to recruitment efforts of these terrorist organizations. Turkey has been supporting efforts in countering narratives and ideologies of terrorism, including within the Global Terrorism, Counterterrorism Forum, and Hedaya, which we heard this morning, and we are ready to contribute further to the efforts of the global community and the United Nations. We have very experienced experts which would be also very interested in participating in such important meetings of the CTC. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Turkey. As I understand it, we do not have much time left, and we still need to have the closing plenary before the end of the meeting. And we still need to listen to the answers to the questions that have been asked. So I apologize that there is no time left for further comments from the room. And with that, I would like to give the floor to the panelists to answer the questions.
Thank you, Mr.
Parot.
Thank you. I wanted to answer to the question that we had early on from Article 19, just to clarify that I'm not working for ICT for Peace. I work for the UN. I work for UN CTED. And just to clarify that the initiative of Tech Against Terrorism has been launched by us, but is implementing by others, first by ICT for Peace, now by another foundation, SecDev Foundation. And the idea is to promote self-regulation. So what we give in our is a political support to promote self-regulation, but also promote the international law framework related to the question of terrorist content. Fair enough, there is no definition of what terrorist content is, but we have still several very important international standards. For example, the sanction list from the UN that define what is a terrorist organization. So a lot of companies are now relying on that to say if the author of that content is from a listed organization, we're not interested to host that content. And then we have international standards on incitement, 1624, question of recruitment. Also, we have Security Council resolution, hate speech, and in terms of international human rights, we have the ICCPR, the Code of Conduct on business and human rights. But of course, when companies are putting in place their own moderation standards, they also have to take care of and implement national laws. And indeed, this is where countries have different notions of what is forbidden and not. But that's not something in which, as the UN, we would comment. On the question of how civil society organization could make their message known better online. This is something that we have been discussing a lot with the industry, because what they tell us is we are not expert in terms of content. We are expert in how to use our platforms to make how to better use our platforms. But we are looking for actual content producers. And companies are saying, they ask us, can you help us to make the connection with people who have credible voices that can bring this message. So to some extent, we're trying to be this matchmakers so that companies can meet with new content producer. But I would say this is something that has to be done more. There's some good practices from big companies, but I think that that's something that needs to be done not only by the big companies of GIFCT, but by smaller companies and companies in originating from other regions that know the reality in their the countries where they operate. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Porret. We're approaching the end of our meeting. Mr. McGilvray has decided not to make any comments. And so with that, we come to the end of the fourth session. I would once again like to thank the panelists and the members of the Counterterrorism Committee, as well as all of the other participants in today's session for their comments and their questions. Thank you.
I would like to invite the Executive Director of CTED, Ms. Michelle Konix, to take the floor.
Muchas gracias, Señor Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Distinguished members of the committee, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my closing remarks can be very short and can be resumed as follows. A heartful thank you to all the speakers, to all the panelists for their invaluable contributions and speeches and statements. Thanks to all of you having joined these very interesting discussions, having actively participated in those discussions, but also my esteemed colleagues and collaborators at CTED, who in close collaboration with the CTC has been working hard behind the scenes before this meeting, open meeting, are working hard during this meeting, actively as speakers or in other capacities, and will work very hard in ensuring, in close cooperation with the CTC, the follow-up of this open meeting. So my heartful appreciation goes to all of you. Interesting discussions indeed of challenges and opportunities in countering terrorist narratives in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2354, which exists since nearly exactly 1 year. And during that last year, we have, of course, seen many profound changes on the ground, not least the successes achieved against ISIL Daesh on the battlefield. They exist, ISIL Daesh, no more as an entity that occupies and controls large parts of the territory, but they do exist as a core platform and as a brand, and so they very much do exist. And it continues to pose a significant threat to international peace and security. In its new shape, appearance, ISIL has proven particularly be adept at harnessing information, using information and communication technologies to recruit new members and to incite and plan attacks around the world. And the narratives of ISIL and other terrorist organizations continue to resonate with many different audiences. Those audiences may have different profiles, but all share the characteristics, very difficult word, of vulnerability and susceptibility, another one, that ISIL seeks to exploit. And the most vulnerable group, and has been underlined here throughout the discussions, are certainly young people, youngsters. And in my very short period of work here at the United Nations, visiting countries, I've constantly been confronted with how big the population is represented by young people, by youth, very young people. So we have to concentrate on those younger population. And in many member states, it's also seen as the most vulnerable part of the population. Terrorists' increasing exploitation of the internet and social media to spread propaganda requires a robust response from the international community. And that response must, of course, be led by the member states in the first place, acting in cooperation with each other and with the United Nations. And it's especially what kind of response that was discussed here today. What is the nature of that response? Of course, speech that either intends to incite terrorist violence or creates a danger of inciting terrorist violence is rightly prohibited by the criminal laws of member states across the globe. This is consistent with international human rights law. The right to freedom of expression, including under Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, is not absolute. But our discussions have also made clear that solemn repressive measures and the taking down of online content intended to incite violence will most probably not alone be sufficient to counter the threat posed by terrorist narratives. Terrorist messages must be addressed in their substance, if not directly, then through counter messages. Those counter messages must expose and invalidate the flaws and the hatred contained in terrorist appeals, using compelling arguments that are founded on reason and analyses and framed in a targeted and thoughtful manner that resonates with terrorist intended audiences. But nor it is enough simply to rebut their arguments. We must also offer positive arguments that promote shared values, community solidarity, and human rights. Our arguments must address the very real concerns that terrorists seek to exploit, and they must propose alternative avenues towards conflict resolution, justice, and empowerment which respect the values and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We must also help build more resilient communities, it has been said all along this day, through genuine partnership with civil society, community and religious leaders, young people, academics, and other non-governmental actors. We must also recognize the crucial role that women can play. Has also been said today in the afternoon especially. Women can play in preventing radicalization both in their families and in the community. All these actors have a vital role to play because they also stand in opposition to terrorism. But these partnerships must be based on a foundation of trust and respect, including for the rights of those in civil society. Non-governmental actors should be seen not as working for governments, but rather as working with them voluntarily. And due regard must be paid to their security and their independence. This point was clearly stated by the committee in its Madrid guiding principles adopted in July 2015. In conclusion, allow me to come back to my first message. Thanks to all of you. Congratulations to the panelists and the speakers for their inspiring statements and speeches. Countering terrorist narratives is indeed an endeavor in which all concerned actors must act together. For only by acting together shall we ensure that our voices drawn out, those of the terrorists. Gracias. Thanks.
Muchas gracias. Participación. Estimados colegas, señoras.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank all the panelists and attendees for making today's event happen. I think you've participated in an active and constructive way in our meeting today. In this short one-day meeting, we have obtained a tremendous amount of useful information to help us in finding the best way forward. We benefited from the expertise of many different actors who shared their insights for the effective implementation of Security Council Resolution 2354 and the Comprehensive International Framework to counter terrorist narratives. This meeting has served to highlight the fact that we share a common understanding. International efforts to counter terrorist narratives require a whole-of-society approach involving member states, the private sector, scholars and academics, civil society and others. Moreover, our efforts in this regard must be anchored in international law, including international human rights law. Resolution 2354, which recognizes the need for genuine partnerships, calls for an annual open meeting to discuss countering terrorist narratives. The committee will continue to engage with all relevant stakeholders, and we look forward to the next meeting in 2019. Once again, thank you very much for your participation, and I would also like to extend my thanks to our friends, the interpreters. I hereby close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Very short and good. Thank you.